Every champion has a secret hero. For basketball legend LeBron James, it was Coach Marcus Thompson, the man who taught him more than just how to shoot hoops at a small community center in Akron, Ohio. He taught him about life, about standing tall when times get tough, and about doing what's right, no matter the cost. But while LeBron soared to NBA stardom, Coach Marcus fell into poverty, living in a cold apartment he could barely afford. His heart medicine sat half-empty on a shelf because he had to choose between food and pills. For 15 years, he kept a secret that destroyed his career but saved his soul. Now, as Marcus watches his former student break another NBA record on his flickering TV screen, he doesn't know that his own game-changing moment is about to begin. Sometimes the biggest victories happen far from any basketball court, and sometimes the student returns to save the teacher. The old TV flickered as LeBron James soared through the air, making another impossible shot look easy. Coach Marcus Thompson leaned forward in his worn armchair, a smile crossing his weathered face. The Lakers were winning, but Marcus wasn't watching the score. He was watching his boy. "That's it, LeBron," he whispered, "just like we practiced." Memory hit him like a fresh breeze. A young LeBron, barely 9 years old, trying that same move on a sunny afternoon 15 years ago. The kid had fallen down 20 times before he got it right. Marcus glanced around his tiny apartment, with its peeling wallpaper and drafty windows. The place was a far cry from the Akron Community Center, where he'd spent the best years of his life. But even now, he could close his eyes and hear the squeak of sneakers on the shiny floor, the thump of basketballs, and the laughter of kids who found their second home on his court. The TV announcer's voice brought him back to the present. Another amazing play by LeBron James. Where does he come up with these moves? Marcus chuckled. He knew exactly where those moves came from. 15 years earlier. Coach Marcus. Coach Marcus. Young LeBron's voice echoed through the community. Center Jim. "I'm ready to learn that spin move you promised." Marcus looked up from the clipboard where he'd been planning practice drills. The skinny 9-year-old was already dribbling a basketball that seemed too big for his hands, but his eyes sparkled with determination. "Hold up there, young fellow," Marcus said, walking over to meet him. "What's our first rule?" LeBron stopped, dribbling, and thought for a moment. "Basketball starts in the mind?" "That's right." Marcus knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. "Before we learn any fancy moves, we need to understand why we're doing them. A spin move isn't just about looking cool. It's about getting past someone who's trying to stop you from reaching your goal. Like in life?" LeBron asked. Marcus's heart swelled. This kid was special. He didn't just hear the lessons, he understood them. Exactly like in life. Sometimes you'll face obstacles, people who try to block your path. But with the right moves and the right mindset, you can get past them. They spent the next hour working on footwork. No actual spinning yet, just the basics. Other coaches might have rushed it, but Marcus knew better. He'd seen too many young players try to run before. They could walk. "Keep your center low," he called out as LeBron practiced his positioning. "Feel the floor beneath your feet. A strong foundation makes everything else possible." The community center wasn't much, just an old building with 2 basketball hoops and a floor that needed resurfacing. But to Marcus, it was a classroom where he could teach more than just basketball. Every drill had a lesson. Every practice had a purpose. Some of the other kids started arriving for afternoon practice. They all wanted to learn the flashy moves they saw on TV, but Marcus had his system. First came discipline, then fundamentals, and only then, when they were ready, the advanced techniques. "Coach, one of the older boys called out. "The high school coach was here earlier. Said they might have a spot for you on their staff." Marcus nodded but kept his focus on LeBron's footwork. He'd heard about the opening: full-time position, better pay, chance to work with more experienced players. But something kept him here, working with kids who needed more than just basketball coaching. "Little wider with that stance, LeBron," he said. "Remember, balance is everything, on and off the court." The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, creating long shadows on the court. Marcus watched as LeBron practiced the same basic move over and over, never complaining, never asking when he'd get to the real stuff. That's what made him different. Even at 9, he understood that greatness was built on small moments like these. "Coach," LeBron said during a water break, "my mom says you used to coach bigger teams. Is that true?" Marcus took a sip from his own water bottle, buying time before answering. "I had some opportunities," he said carefully, "but sometimes the biggest impact you can make isn't in the biggest arena." "I don't understand," LeBron said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You will someday." Marcus patted him on the shoulder. "Now, let's see that footwork one more time. Then maybe, just maybe, we'll start working on that spin move." LeBron's face lit up, and he rushed back to his spot on the court. Marcus watched him go, feeling that familiar mix of pride and purpose that had kept him at this small community center, while other coaches chased bigger dreams. The memory faded, and Marcus found himself back in his apartment, watching the adult, LeBron, make yet another incredible play. The TV commentators were going wild, but they didn't know the half of it. They saw the end result, the polished moves, the perfect execution. They hadn't seen the hours of practice, the falls, the lessons learned. Marcus's eyes drifted to the small table beside his chair, where a single framed photo sat among his bills and medicine bottles. It showed a young LeBron, arm around Marcus's shoulders, both of them grinning after winning their first community tournament. The trophy wasn't much, just a small plastic thing, but their smiles could have lit up the whole city of Akron. The game on TV was ending now. The Lakers had won, and LeBron had put up amazing numbers as usual. Marcus felt that old familiar pride, but it was mixed with something else, a heaviness he couldn't quite name. He reached for his remote to turn off the TV, but his hand trembled and he dropped it. The batteries rolled under his chair, and he didn't have the energy to pick them up. The medicine he couldn't quite afford was wearing off, and the pain was coming back. "Great game, LeBron," he whispered to the silent room. "Great game." Outside his window, the streets of Akron were quiet. Somewhere in the city, kids were probably practicing on playground courts, dreaming of being the next LeBron James. Marcus wondered if they had someone to teach them about balance, about building strong foundations, about life beyond the game. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could still hear the squeak of sneakers on the community center floor. But when he opened them, he was still in his small apartment, with its stack of unpaid bills and the growing darkness of another lonely evening. The TV continued to play, showing highlights from the game. Marcus watched until his eyes grew heavy, remembering a time when his life had been filled with the simple joy of teaching young players about more than just basketball. He'd made his choice back then, and even now, sitting in his cold apartment, he knew it had been the right one. What he didn't know was that his story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Marcus woke up to a familiar sound, the radiator making that awful clicking noise that meant it was about to give up again. He pulled his thin blanket tighter around his shoulders and looked at the thermostat. 58 degrees. Not the coldest it had been this winter, but cold enough. He reached for his pill bottle on the nightstand. counting what was left. 3 pills. The prescription had run out, and his next Social Security check wouldn't come for another week. Marcus did the math in his head, something he'd gotten too good at lately. Food or medicine. It always came down to that choice. The walls of his apartment were mostly bare now. The spots where his coaching certificates and team photos used to hang were marked by slightly darker rectangles on the faded wallpaper. He'd sold most of them last year to help pay for Helen's final hospital stay. His wife had fought cancer, with the same determination he'd taught his players. But sometimes, even the strongest defense wasn't enough. The only thing he'd kept was that old basketball tucked away in his closet. The one with young LeBron's signature, back when the kid was just learning to write in cursive. To Coach Marcus, thanks for believing in me. The signature was faded now, but the memory was still sharp. Marcus made his way to the kitchen, his joints protesting every step. The community center had closed 5 years ago. Budget cuts, they said. He'd tried to find other coaching jobs, but doors kept closing before he could even get his foot in. It was strange. He had the experience, the references, everything he needed. But something always came up at the last minute. The coffee was instant, the bread was day-old from the discount rack, but Marcus said grace anyway. Helen had taught him that gratitude wasn't about what you had, but about keeping your heart open to blessings that might come. A knock at the door startled him. His neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, stood there with her newspaper. "Thought you might. Want to see this, Marcus?" she said, pointing to a small article on page 6. "They're talking about tearing down the old community center, making it into a parking lot or something." Marcus took the paper with shaking hands. There it was, in black and white. The city council would vote next week on the demolition proposal. His old classroom, where he'd taught so many kids about more than just basketball, would be turned into parking spaces. "You okay?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, noticing his expression. "Fine," Marcus said, but his voice cracked. "Just fine." After she left, Marcus sat heavily in his chair. The TV was still on from last night, showing morning sports highlights. They were talking about LeBron again. Another record broken, another milestone reached. He thought about all the kids who'd come through those community center doors. Not just LeBron, though he'd gone the furthest. There was Tommy, who'd never made it to the NBA but was now a successful teacher. Maria, who'd learned enough about discipline and dedication to become a doctor. Jimmy, who'd gotten off the streets and now ran his own business. The sound of his phone ringing pulled him from his thoughts. It was an unknown number, but Marcus answered anyway. These days, he couldn't afford to miss any calls. "Mr. Thompson," a woman's voice asked. "This is Sarah Chen from the Akron Beacon-Journal. I'm working on a story about LeBron James's early years in Akron, and your name came up. Would you be willing to talk about the time you spent coaching him?" Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. He'd had calls like this before, reporters looking for heartwarming stories about LeBron's childhood, but something in her voice was different, more serious. "Not much to tell," he said carefully. "He was a good kid who worked hard." "I have some interesting photographs," Sarah continued, "from the community center, including one that raised some questions. Would you be willing to meet?" Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with his broken radiator. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that might explain why a coach with your record hasn't been able to find work in 5 years. The kind that might explain why certain people seem very interested in keeping you away from basketball." Marcus looked at his nearly empty pill bottle, at the stack of unpaid bills, at the dark rectangles on his walls where his life's memories used to hang. "Mr. Thompson? Are you there?" He thought about that day 15 years ago, about the choice he'd made, about integrity and consequences, about doing the right thing even when it cost you everything. "I'm here," he said quietly. "But I'm not sure I can help you." "Please," Sarah said. "This isn't just about a story. I think someone's been watching you, Mr. Thompson. And I think they're worried about what you might say." Through his window, Marcus could see dark clouds gathering over Akron. A storm was coming. He looked at the newspaper article about the community center's demolition. Then at that old photo of him and young LeBron, both of them smiling, neither of them knowing what lay ahead. "Ms. Chen," he said finally, "some stories are better left in the past." "Are they?" she asked. "Or are they just waiting for the right time to be told?" Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 15 years of silence pressing down on him. Sometimes the hardest defense wasn't on the basketball court. Sometimes it was keeping quiet when every part of you wanted to speak the truth. "I'll think about it," he said, and hung up before she could say more. The rain started falling outside, pattering against his window like a basketball being dribbled on an empty court. Marcus sat in his cold apartment, surrounded by the echoes of his past decisions, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was time to run a different play. Sarah Chen spread the old photographs across her desk at the Akron Beacon Journal. One showed a piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. Young LeBron at the community center, Coach Marcus teaching kids, tournament celebrations. But it was that one photo, taken on a sunny afternoon in 1999, that kept drawing her attention. In the foreground, Marcus was showing LeBron how to position his feet for a jump shot. But in the background, partially hidden by the gym's exit door, a man in a dark suit was watching. She'd found the same man in 3 other photos from different days. Always watching, never approaching. Her phone buzzed. A text from her editor. "Got anything solid on the LeBron story?" Sarah looked at her notes. She'd spent weeks tracking down former players from the community center. Everyone remembered Coach Marcus. Everyone spoke about him with respect, even love. But when she asked why he'd suddenly stopped coaching, they all got quiet. The rain was still falling when she pulled up to Marcus's apartment building. It wasn't much. 4 stories of brick that had seen better days. A far cry from where someone who'd helped shape one of basketball's greatest players should be living. She found his door and knocked, trying to ignore the peeling paint and the faint smell of mold in the hallway. "Mr. Thompson?" she called. "It's Sarah Chen. We spoke on the phone." The door opened slowly. Marcus looked older in person than in the photos, more tired. But his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. "Come in," he said quietly. "But I still don't know what I can tell you." Sarah entered the small apartment, noticing how bare the walls were. Her reporter's instincts kicked in. Something had forced this man to sell everything he owned. She pulled out the photographs and laid them on his small coffee table. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he looked at them. "These are from Tommy Rodriguez," she explained. "He kept a whole album from his time at the center. Said you changed his life." Marcus picked up one of the photos, smiling faintly. "Tommy, he's a teacher now, up in Cleveland." "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said gently, "I need to show you something." She pointed to the man in the background. "Do you know who this is?" Marcus's face changed. Just for a second, but Sarah caught it, a flash of fear, quickly hidden. "Just someone watching practice," he said. "Parents did that sometimes." "The same parent? 4 different days? Always in a suit?" Sarah pulled out more photos. "And look, at this." She showed him a newspaper clipping from 1998, the year before he came to Akron. It showed the same man standing with a group of college basketball officials. Marcus stood up suddenly, walking to his window. "Ms. Chen, you seem like a good reporter, but there are some stories that shouldn't be dug up. Like why every coaching job you've applied for in the past 5 years has mysteriously fallen through," Sarah pressed. "Or why the community centers. Funding was cut right after you started asking questions about certain game outcomes." Outside, thunder rumbled. Marcus's hands gripped the windowsill. "You don't understand," he said. "Some people, they have long memories and longer reach." Sarah pulled out one more photo. This one was from a high school championship game in 1998, just before Marcus left his old coaching job. The point spread. In this game was unusual. Some people thought it had been fixed, but one coach refused to play along. He was going to speak up, but then he suddenly resigned and disappeared. Marcus turned around slowly. "Where did you get that?" The real question is, why did you really come to Akron, Mr. Thompson? And why have certain people spent 15 years making sure you never coached at a high level again? Marcus sank back into his chair. He looked at the photo of young LeBron on his table, then at the stack of unpaid bills beside it. "You know what? I taught those kids," he said finally. "That integrity matters more than winning, that some things are worth losing for." He picked up the photo of the man in the suit. "But I never thought the price would be so high." Sarah leaned forward. "Tell me the truth, Mr. Thompson. All of it. Maybe it's time people knew what really happened." Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. His face went pale as he listened. "I understand," he said, and hung up. "Who was that?" Sarah asked. Marcus looked at her, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes. "You need to leave," he said. "Now, and take these photos with you." "But, please," he said, "some truths are dangerous, not just for me, but for everyone involved." As Sarah gathered her photos, she noticed Marcus looking at that picture of young LeBron again. She thought about the man who'd given up everything to teach kids about integrity, and about the people who'd spent 15 years punishing him for it. "I'll be back," she said at the door. Marcus nodded. "Be careful, Ms. Chen. You're playing a game where not everyone follows the rules." After she left, Marcus sat in his darkening apartment, listening to the rain. The phone call had been clear. Stay quiet, or else. But for the first time in 15 years, he wondered if silence was really the right defense anymore. He walked to his closet and pulled out that old basketball with LeBron's signature. Maybe it was time for one last lesson about integrity, about standing up when life tried to knock you down. Maybe it was time to show that what he'd taught all those years ago wasn't just talk. But as he reached for his phone to call Sarah back, headlights swept across his window. A black car was parked outside, its engine running. Someone was watching. Someone was always watching. Marcus stepped away from the window, his heart pounding. The black car remained idle for a few more minutes, then slowly drove away. But its message was clear. They were still there, still watching, after all these years. He sat in his old armchair, the signed basketball in his lap, and let his mind drift back to one of the most important lessons he'd ever taught. Summer of 1999. "I can't do it, coach!" Young LeBron threw the basketball against the wall in frustration. They'd been working on a new move for 3 hours, and nothing was clicking. "Maybe I'm not as good as everyone thinks I am." Marcus picked up the ball and walked over to where LeBron had slumped against the wall. Instead of speaking, he led the boy to the old mirror he'd hung in the community center's office. "What do you see?" Marcus asked. "Just me," LeBron mumbled. "Just a kid who can't get anything right today." Marcus took a hammer from his desk drawer and, without warning, cracked the mirror. Not enough to shatter it, but enough to create a web of cracks across its surface. LeBron jumped. "Coach, won't you get in trouble?" "Look again," Marcus said. "What do you see now?" LeBron stared at his fractured reflection. "I see. Lots of pieces of me." "Exactly." Marcus put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sometimes we get broken. Sometimes nothing works right. But look closer. Even with all those cracks, you're still there. All of you. Just split into pieces that need to come back together." LeBron touched the mirror. "But how?" "By understanding that being broken doesn't mean being finished. Every crack is a chance to rebuild stronger." Marcus handed him the basketball. "Now, let's try that move again." They worked until sunset. By the time LeBron's mother came to pick him up, he'd mastered the move. But more importantly, he'd learned something about resilience. Present day, Sarah Chen sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen. She'd been digging through old newspaper archives all night, and something wasn't adding up. According to the official records, Marcus Thompson had resigned from his high school coaching position in 1998 for personal reasons. But she'd found a small article from a week before his resignation. His team had been favored to win the IBD state championship by an unusually large margin. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Drop the story. Some histories should stay buried." Sarah saved another article to her folder. This one was about a gambling investigation in high school sports that had been suddenly closed in 1998. No charges filed, no names mentioned, just a quiet end to what had promised to be a major scandal. She looked at the photo of the man in the suit again. After hours of searching, she'd found his name. James Wheeler, former sports betting consultant turned high school athletics administrator. The same man who'd been watching Marcus's practices at the community center. Her phone rang. It was one of her sources, a former referee. "I shouldn't be telling you this," he said, his voice shaky. "But that championship game in '98? Coach Thompson came to me before the game. Said some people had approached him about keeping the score reasonable. He wouldn't do it. A week later, he was gone." "And the investigation?" Sarah asked. "Disappeared? Faster than morning dew. Listen, you didn't hear this from me. These people, they don't forget." After hanging up, Sarah spread all her evidence on her desk. The photos of Wheeler watching the community center. The sudden closure of the gambling investigation. Marcus's mysterious inability to find coaching, work. The community center's convenient budget cuts. Her editor walked by. "Chen, you look like you've seen a ghost." "More like I've found one," she said. "A 15-year-old ghost that never really died." She gathered her things and headed for Marcus's apartment. The rain had started again, drumming against her car roof as she drove. She had more pieces now, but the picture they formed was darker than she'd expected. When she arrived, Marcus was still sitting in his chair, that old basketball in his lap. "They were here," he said before she could speak. "The black car." Sarah sat down across from him. "I know about the championship game," she said softly. "About Wheeler. About the investigation." Marcus's hands tightened on the basketball. "Then, you know why I can't talk?" "But LeBron," she started. "Doesn't know any of this," Marcus cut in. "And it needs to stay that way. He was just a kid who needed someone to believe in him. That's all that matters." Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him the threatening text. "They're watching both of us now." Marcus looked at the cracked plaster of his apartment wall, remembering that broken mirror from long ago. Sometimes being broken didn't mean being finished. Sometimes it meant being ready to rebuild. Maybe, he said slowly, it's time for one more lesson about standing up after you've been knocked down. Outside, another black car drove by, its headlights cutting through the rain. But this time, Marcus didn't move away from the window. This time, he stood his ground. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, across town, someone else was looking at an old photo from the community center. Someone who remembered every lesson about integrity and courage. Someone who was about to change everything. The pain started in the middle of the night. Marcus clutched his chest, gasping for air. He'd been rationing his heart medication, trying to make it last until his next check came. But tonight, his body was done waiting. He reached for his phone, with shaking hands, but it slipped from his fingers, clattering under the bed. The room spun as he tried to bend down to reach it. The last thing he heard was someone pounding on his door. Mrs. Rodriguez must have heard him fall. The ambulance lights painted his apartment building in flashing red and white. Sarah Chen arrived just as they were loading Marcus into the back. She'd been working late at the office when Mrs. Rodriguez called her, using the business card Sarah had left earlier. "He's had a heart attack," the neighbor said, wringing her hands. "I heard the thump through the wall. He wasn't taking his medicine right, trying to save money, you know." Sarah followed the ambulance to Akron General Medical Center. In the Eider waiting room, she pulled out her laptop and started typing. The story was taking shape now, but it wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about a man who'd sacrificed everything for what he believed in, and the people who'd made him pay for it. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "Last warning. Walk away." Instead of being scared, Sarah felt angry. She thought about Marcus, lying in a hospital bed because he couldn't afford his medicine. About all the jobs he'd been denied. About 15 years of silence and fear. She started digging deeper. Wheeler wasn't just a former sports betting consultant. He was connected to 3 other high school sports gambling investigations that had mysteriously disappeared. Each time, coaches or officials who might have talked suddenly left town or stopped working in sports. The doctor finally came out around midnight. "Mr. Thompson is stable, but he needs surgery. His heart condition is serious. Without it..." The doctor left the sentence hanging. "How much?" Sarah asked. The number made her wince. Even with Medicare, Marcus's part would be more than he'd make. In 2 years, she went to his room. Marcus was awake but groggy, tubes and wires connecting him to beeping machines. "You should have told me about the medicine," she said softly. "Couldn't afford." "Both food and pills," he mumbled. "Had to choose." Sarah pulled up a chair. "I'm going to run the story, Mr. Thompson. All of it. The gambling, Wheeler, the threats, everything." Marcus tried to sit up, but couldn't. "They'll come after you too. Let them try." Sarah showed him what she'd found. "Wheeler's done this before. Other coaches, other schools. But this time, we have proof. The photos. The pattern. Your story." "And LeBron?" Marcus asked. "He'll find out what really happened?" "Yes, but he'll also find out about a coach who gave up everything to protect the game, to teach kids about more than just winning." Marcus closed his eyes. The monitors beeped, steadily in the quiet room. "Maybe it's time," he said finally. "Been carrying this too long anyway." Sarah squeezed his hand and left to make some calls. In the hospital hallway, she didn't notice the man watching her from behind a newspaper. She didn't see him make a phone call as soon as she was gone. "She's going to run the story," he said quietly. "Thompson's in the hospital. Heart attack." "Yes, sir. I understand." Back in his room, Marcus dreamed of the community center. Of kids, learning more than basketball. of a young LeBron James understanding that some things matter more than winning. He didn't know that across town, Sarah's story was already spreading through the internet like wildfire. A nurse came in to check his vitals. "You have a visitor," she said. "Says he's an old friend." Marcus opened his eyes, expecting to see Sarah again. Instead, a tall figure stood in the doorway, familiar even in the dim light. "Coach," said LeBron James softly, "we need to talk." But before either man could say another word, Wheeler appeared behind LeBron, his face dark with anger. The secret that had been buried for 15 years was about to explode, and no one could predict who would be left standing when the dust settled. "Mr. Wheeler," LeBron said without turning around, "I thought I might find you here." The tension in the hospital room could have stopped a clock. Marcus tried to sit up straighter in his bed, the heart monitor beeping faster. Wheeler stepped into the room, his usual smooth confidence cracking slightly. "This is a private matter, LeBron. You should go." "No," LeBron's voice was firm. "I saw Sarah Chen's article about the gambling, about what really happened 15 years ago. Sarah had done it. She'd published the story." Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. But Wheeler wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone. "One call, and every major sports network gets proof that Coach Thompson here was involved in fixing games. His reputation, everything he taught you, gone." "Lies," Marcus said, his voice weak but clear. "The truth doesn't matter," Wheeler smiled. "Only what people believe." LeBron turned to Marcus. "Coach, I need to hear it from you. All of it." Marcus looked at his former student, now a grown man who'd achieved everything they'd dreamed about in that old community center. He thought about all the lessons they'd shared, about integrity, about standing up when life knocked you down. "It was the championship game," Marcus started. "They wanted me to keep the score close, said they had money riding on the point spread. When I refused—" He paused, catching his breath. "When I refused, they threatened to ruin me. Said they'd make sure I never coached again." "But you still said no," LeBron said quietly. "Some things matter more than winning." Marcus quoted the lesson he'd taught so many times. Some things matter more than money. Wheeler stepped forward. "Very touching. But if this story gets out, a lot of powerful people will be very unhappy. People who can end careers. Even yours, LeBron." LeBron looked at the man who'd been haunting his old coach for 15 years. "You know what Coach Marcus taught me about bullies? They only have power if you let them scare you." Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, her phone recording everything. Behind her stood 2 FBI agents. "James Wheeler," one agent said, "we'd like to talk to you about some irregularities in high school sports betting patterns going back to 1998. Wheeler's face went pale. "You can't prove anything." "Actually," Sarah said, "we can. Those photos of you watching the community center? They weren't the only ones. A lot of coaches kept records. They were just too scared to come forward. Until now." As the agents led Wheeler away, Marcus felt tears in his eyes. 15 years of looking over his shoulder, of living in fear, of watching opportunities slip away. It was finally over. LeBron sat on the edge of the hospital bed. "Why didn't you tell me, Coach? All these years?" "You were just a kid," Marcus said. "You needed someone to believe in, not someone running from the past." "I saw your apartment," LeBron continued. "The bills, the medicine you couldn't afford, all because you stood up for what was right." Sarah stepped closer. "The story's already going viral. People are asking how the man who helped shape LeBron James ended up unable to afford heart medicine. "I didn't do it for recognition," Marcus protested. "No," LeBron said. "You did it because it was right. Just like you taught us." He pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a social media post. It was that old photo of them at the community center, next to a new picture of Marcus's run-down apartment. The caption read, "The true price of integrity. Time to make this right." Marcus looked at the thousands of shares and comments already pouring in. People sharing stories about how he'd changed their lives. Former players talking about the lessons they'd learned. "Your story isn't just about basketball anymore," Sarah said. "It's about standing up to corruption, about choosing integrity over success." LeBron stood up. "And it's about making things right. But first, you need that surgery. And don't worry about the cost." "LeBron, I can't let you. You didn't let me give up when I wanted to quit. Now it's my turn not to let you give up." As he introduced him, if on cue, Marcus's chest tightened again. The monitors started beeping faster. "We need a doctor in here," Sarah called out. The last thing Marcus saw before everything went dark was LeBron's worried face. The last thing he heard was his former student's voice. "Hold on, coach. Your best lessons are still ahead." But neither of them knew just how right those words would turn out to be. The surgery took 6 hours. LeBron paced the hospital waiting room while Sarah worked on her laptop, updating her story with new information pouring in from other coaches who'd been silenced over the years. "This goes deeper than we thought," she said, showing LeBron her screen. "Wheeler wasn't working alone. There was a whole network of people fixing high school games. Coach Marcus was the first one who tried to stop them." Finally, the doctor emerged, still wearing his surgical mask. "The surgery was successful. He's weak, but stable. You can see him soon." LeBron let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at his phone. Hundreds of messages from other NBA players, all asking how they could help. The story had exploded across social media. When they entered Marcus's room, he was awake, but groggy. The machines beeped steadily, a rhythmic reminder that he was still fighting. "Coach," LeBron said softly, "there's something you need to know." He showed Marcus his phone. The headlines were everywhere. LeBron's former coach exposes 15-year basketball scandal. High school sports betting, ring uncovered. The coach who sacrificed everything for integrity. "Wheeler's not the only one the FBI arrested," Sarah added. "They're picking up people all across the state. Other coaches are coming forward with evidence they've been hiding for years." Marcus tried to speak, but his voice was weak. LeBron had to lean in close to hear him. "The community center," Marcus whispered. "Don't worry about that," LeBron smiled. "I already bought the building. No more parking lot plans. We're going to rebuild it, better than ever. A place where kids can learn the same lessons you taught me." Tears formed in Marcus's eyes. But before he could respond, a new visitor appeared in the doorway. A man in an expensive suit, his hair gray at the temples. LeBron recognized him immediately. The commissioner of high school sports for Ohio. "Coach Thompson," the commissioner said, his voice heavy. "We need to talk." Sarah stood up, her reporter's instincts on high alert. "About what?" "About making this right." The commissioner stepped into the room. "We've known about Wheeler's operation for years, but we could never prove anything. Too many people were paid to look the other way. Until now." He placed a thick folder on Marcus's bedside table. "This contains proof that you were blacklisted. Every job application that was mysteriously denied, every funding cut that wasn't a coincidence. Wheeler had people everywhere making sure you couldn't work in sports again." Marcus's heart monitor beeped faster. LeBron put a protective hand on his coach's shoulder. "Why now?" Sarah asked. "Why come forward after 15 years?" The commissioner looked tired. "Because sometimes it takes one person's courage to give others courage. Your story, Coach Thompson, it's inspired people to speak up. The whole corrupt system is falling apart." But there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words. Something that made Sarah step closer to Marcus's bed. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked. The commissioner nodded slowly. "Wheeler, he's offering to make a deal. He says he has evidence that could change everything. Evidence about that championship game that started all this." Marcus tried to sit up straighter. "What evidence?" "He says." The commissioner hesitated. "He says you weren't the only one who knew about the point-shaving scheme, that someone else was involved, someone who's now very powerful in basketball." The room went quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. LeBron looked at his old coach, seeing the same strength in his eyes that had taught a 9-year-old boy never to give up. "Wheeler's lying," LeBron said firmly. "He's trying to save himself." But Marcus was staring at something only he could see, a memory from 15 years ago swimming to the surface. "Not lying," he whispered. "There was someone else, someone I've been protecting all these years." "Who?" Sarah leaned forward with her recorder. Before Marcus could answer, the hospital room door slammed open. A man stood there, his face hidden in shadow. But Marcus recognized him immediately, and suddenly, everything made terrible sense. The truth that had been buried for 15 years wasn't just about game fixing, it was about loyalty, about choices made in desperate moments, about secrets kept to protect the innocent. LeBron saw the recognition in his coach's eyes, saw the mix of fear and relief that crossed his face. "It's time," the mysterious figure said. "Time to tell them everything." And in that moment, Marcus knew the real game was just beginning. The man who stepped into the hospital room was Tommy Rodriguez, Marcus's former player, now a high school teacher in Cleveland. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Marcus's old assistant coach from the championship team, Mike Sullivan. "I'm sorry, Coach," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "I can't keep quiet anymore." Marcus looked at his former player, then at Mike. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You knew," he said to Mike. "You knew about Wheeler's scheme all along." Mike nodded slowly. "I was young, desperate. My wife was sick. We needed money. Wheeler approached me first, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed the head coach's cooperation. So that's why they wanted me to keep the score close," Marcus said, quietly. "You were already part of their operation." LeBron and Sarah watched in silence as 15 years of secrets finally came to light. "When you refused," Mike continued, "Wheeler panicked. They had too much money riding on that game. So they threatened to expose that I'd been fixing games all season. But you..." He looked at Marcus with tears in his eyes. "You took the fall, resigned before they could investigate, protected me, protected the team." Tommy stepped forward. "I was the team manager that year, just a kid, but I saw everything. Took those photos of Wheeler watching practice because something felt wrong. When you came to Akron, Coach, I followed. Wanted to make sure you were okay. But Wheeler followed too," Sarah pieced together. "Kept watching, making sure Marcus never got close to high-level coaching again. Afraid he'd talk." Marcus's heart monitor beeped steadily as he absorbed the truth. "Mike, what happened to you?" "After? Wheeler's people got me a job in college sports. Good money, but..." Mike's voice cracked. "Every game, Every season, I remembered what you'd sacrificed, how you chose integrity over everything. LeBron looked at his old coach with new understanding. You didn't just teach us about doing the right thing. You lived it, even when it cost you everything. The commissioner cleared his throat. Coach Thompson, the state athletic board wants to make this right. Full reinstatement. Public apology. Compensation for lost wages. But Marcus was looking at Mike. What about you? I'm turning myself in, Mike said. Tommy's photos, my testimony. It's enough to bring down Wheeler's whole network, including me. Sarah's phone buzzed with news alerts. The story was exploding. More coaches coming forward, more evidence of fixed games, a corruption scandal that had poisoned high school sports for decades, finally exposed. Coach, LeBron said, remember what you taught me about that spin move? How sometimes you have to turn into the pressure instead of away from it. Marcus nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. Well, LeBron continued, I'm announcing a new youth basketball program, the Marcus Thompson Initiative for Sports Integrity, teaching kids that character matters more than victory. And I want to help, Mike added, after I serve my time. Maybe teaching kids about the price of wrong choices, the value of integrity. Tommy pulled out one last photo from his pocket. It showed young LeBron and Marcus at the community center, but this time, Wheeler wasn't lurking in the background. It was just a coach and his player, both smiling, both believing in something bigger than winning. This is the real story, Tommy said. Not the scandal, not the corruption. This is what you gave us, Coach. A foundation that couldn't be broken. Marcus looked around the room. At LeBron, the kid who became a legend. At Tommy, who never forgot his lessons. At Mike, choosing truth after 15 years of lies. At Sarah, who helped bring everything to light. The machines beeped steadily, but Marcus felt stronger than he had in years. The weight of secrets was lifting, replaced by something that felt like hope. You know what the hardest part was? He said softly. Not the poverty, not the lost jobs. It was wondering if the lessons I taught meant anything. If integrity really mattered in a world that seemed to reward the opposite. They mattered, LeBron assured him. Every lesson, every day. A week later, Marcus stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new community center. His doctors had protested, but he insisted on being there. The crowd cheered as LeBron handed him a shovel. Wheeler and his network were facing federal charges. Mike had made a plea deal. The commissioner had resigned. But none of that seemed as important as the kids watching from the sidelines, their eyes full of dreams. Some people thought this story was about corruption in sports, Sarah told the crowd. But it's really about a coach who taught kids that how you play the game matters more than whether you win or lose. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, still weak but standing tall. 15 years ago, I made a choice, he said. Today, we're all making a choice to build something new, something based on truth, on integrity, on doing what's right, even when it's hard. He looked at LeBron, remembering a young boy learning about more than just basketball. Sometimes life knocks you down, he continued, but it's not about how many times you fall. It's about how many times you get back up. And sometimes, he smiled at the watching kids, sometimes you get back up stronger than ever. The shovel bit into the earth, breaking ground for a new beginning. And this time, Marcus knew they were playing by the right rules. And that's the story of Coach Marcus Thompson and LeBron James. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments below. If this story touched you, smash that like button and subscribe for more inspiring true stories. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.